I live here in Edmonds, and I've lived here for about 20 years right now. How many of you live in Edmonds? How many of you don't live in Edmonds? There are a few. How many of you love Edmonds? That's everybody. All right, great. Well, that's me too. I love Edmonds. And a lot of the reason why I'm here is because I just get so caught up in my community. I love to give my time and volunteer, and part of that is coming here to talk with you today. You notice down here, I do serve on the Edmonds Historic Preservation Commission, and that's a group of people that work to preserve old buildings and historic sites and things like that here in Edmonds. Places like the Carnegie Library, places like the historic homes along 4th Avenue, like that. And I also am part of the Edmonds Historical Museum, and I serve with Teresa on the board. So I just can't keep away from historical things and giving my time to this town that I really love. And we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Edmonds. And you guys are doing Washington State history this year, right? Okay, so some of this stuff I think you're probably going to have already heard about and are somewhat familiar with it. Now, all I have to do is touch the board with this and it changes the slide?
That's the point.
Whoa, it did! Wow. Okay. Edmonds started out as a forest. Where we are right now was dense, dense forest. And this is old growth Pacific Northwest forest. You know what old growth forest is, what it means? Tell me.
They're some of the first trees. They get really, really big, and they've been there for a long time.
These are the trees that haven't been cut. This is what was here when the loggers first came in and started harvesting trees. Once these are cut down, another forest will grow up, and that's always called secondary growth. And those trees are never quite as big as the old growth. The old growth around here is mostly western red cedar and western hemlock. Those are the two species that dominate our old growth forest. And these get huge. I mean, these are hundreds of years old. Some of these cedars are more than 300 years old that you see right here. There are still little patches of old growth forest around, and there are places where you can go to see them. But this is what covered all of Edmonds, right where we're sitting now, all the way down to the waterfront. Here's another shot of some old growth trees. Look at these things. They're huge. Now this is in a little bit of old growth forest that's been preserved now. There's some of this up on Whidbey Island, and there's various other small patches of it. But if you get a chance to go look at it, do it. It's just wonderful. It's like a cathedral in there. The trees just rise so high. Look at the size of this tree. These were the old cedars that were here. And the first explorers came through and saw this area. Now, one thing that those cedars can be good for is to build canoes. And there were Native Americans who lived here before the Europeans came. They used these cedars, carved them out, and built these wonderful dugout canoes. There were a number of tribes, and you've all studied the Native Americans in the Puget Sound area, right? So you know a lot about this. You could probably educate me on it. Please feel free to jump in if you need to. But there were many, many settlements. There were various tribes and settlements of Native Americans that lived all around Puget Sound. And they would go back and forth between the settlements in these canoes. And Puget Sound was like the superhighway. They would get in the canoes and they would go between settlements. There was trade of goods. You know, one place might do a certain kind of wood carving. Another settlement might specialize in whalebone carving, and they could trade these. There were cultural exchanges, intermarriages, and Puget Sound was the superhighway that connected all of these Native American settlements, and the Native American canoes were like the trucks, the vehicles, the cars that are on the superhighway now, but these went up and down Puget Sound. Here's a picture from back probably around the turn of the last century. I can't say turn of the century anymore because that was 15 years ago. The turn of the last century, when about 1900, prior to 1900. Some Native American canoes. Another Native American canoe here, photographed on Puget Sound back around 1900, 1890, something like that. Here's a bunch of them docked up by Victoria, BC. And notice the date, August 8th. That's not 2003, that's 1903. So that's more than 100 years ago. And this was one of the major places where they would stop. And again, this was part of just this superhighway and trade that was going on out on Puget Sound that was plied by these canoes. Here are some of the canoes laden down with goods. They were like the delivery trucks. They would go back and forth, okay? And here's a Native American family with one of their canoes. And this rather busy map, and I'm not going to go through and try to name everything for you, this shows the Puget Sound Basin and the location of all the various Native American settlements that were here. And all these tribes taken together comprise what we loosely call the Pacific Northwest Coastal Native Americans.
Have you located your Native American tribe? Okay. They all took one and wrote a report on that.
Wonderful. Oh, good. Okay. Well, again, feel free to chime in if you want to. Just raise a hand and we'll call you along the way. So this was this very busy, very active, very vibrant, very complex culture that was here before Europeans came to the Puget Sound area. And in 1791, this guy was the first European of major importance anyway to arrive in the area. Does anybody know who this is? Whoa! Okay, tell me.
George Vancouver.
You got it, George Vancouver. And when did George Vancouver come here? Can you tell me that? You know the date?
1870.
No, before that.
1770.
1791. In 1791, George Vancouver was sent here by the British Admiralty to look through the Puget Sound area, map it out, make charts, and look at it as a potential place for settlement. He did a pretty cursory job of this. George Vancouver came in, he had two ships. He had his main ship, which was, if you know about George Vancouver, you know what his ship was called, right?
Something Vancouver.
No, a good guess. Just Discover. And they had a smaller tender ship called the Chatham. And these two ships came into Puget Sound around 1791. And if you were sitting down here on the beach at Edmonds, at Brackett's Landing, and were watching, you'd see George Vancouver's ships go down through Puget Sound, heading south, and then you'd wait around for about a month, and then you'd see him sail right back up out again. He didn't stop here in Edmonds at all, but he did explore Puget Sound. One of the things I love about history is how alive it is and how we're always finding out new things. And the Chatham, in the charts and the logs of the ship, got stuck in a storm as they were coming down through here, and they anchored, and the storm was so strong that it blew the ship off of the anchor, broke the anchor chain, and they found it just a couple of years ago right off of Whidbey Island. This had been lost for centuries. And some divers found the anchor from the Chatham. This is from 2014, so it's just been a little more than a year that they discovered this. So again, that's part of the things that I love about history, is how it keeps growing and how we keep finding new things. Okay, so George Vancouver came in and looked at this in 1791. Now, you know that in 1776 was the Declaration of Independence, and the United States was a brand new country. And as we moved into the 1800s, the United States was looking more and more toward the western part of the continent, where we are right now, as a place for people to settle. And the United States government sent out this fellow. His name is Charles Wilkes, and he came out here in 1841 to look around the Puget Sound area and make charts and maps and look at it with an idea of opening it up for homesteaders. The government wanted to allow people to come out to this area and set up homesteads and live here and populate the area. You have a hand up?
Charles Wilkes also discovered Hersey Island.
Yes, he did. And he actually named Point, what we call now Point Edmund over here. I think he called it Point Edwards. Or it was maybe the other. No, it's Point Edwards now. He named it Point Edmund. And some people say that's how Edmonds got its name. Good. Oh my gosh, Charles Wilkes, this is fantastic. I love this group. Anyway, Charles Wilkes came out here in 1841 to map the area out. And he came back with lots of detailed charts and lots of nice locations where homesteaders could go. Now, you all know who this is, right? Who doesn't know who this is? Okay, you don't know who it is. Okay, well, let me enlighten you then.
Whose president is this?
Jax.
He doesn't know. This is President Abraham Lincoln. He was the 16th President of the United States. And in 1862, let me go back for a minute. Abraham Lincoln's famous for a lot of things. I mean, what's Abraham Lincoln most famous for?
Getting
Stopping slavery.
Right, the Emancipation Proclamation and ending slavery. He also led the Union through the Civil War years, and he preserved the Union. He was among, by almost any measure, one of the greatest presidents we have ever had. But in 1862, he signed a piece of legislation called the Homestead Act, which was very important for us out here in the Puget Sound area. What the Homestead Act did was tell people that there's all this nice government land in places like Washington Territory, and you can come out and you can take 160 acres of this land, and if you live on it and work it for 4 years, it's yours. You get the deed to it. You don't have to pay a cent. Just have to live there and work on it for 4 years. What a great deal. So folks started coming out and doing this, and this is the kind of thing that they would fill out to say, okay, here's my land, here's where I'm putting up my 4 little stakes, and I'm going to work this land for 4 years, and then I'll own it. And there was a guy that came to Edmonds. It wasn't called Edmonds at the time, but where we are right now, and he had a really cool name. His first name was Pleasant. That must mean he was a really nice guy. And his last name was Yule. Pleasant Yule came out here in 1866, and he homesteaded in this area. Now, this is not Pleasant Yule's cabin. This is another cabin, but it's much like, I'm sure, what he was in. These are pine trees in the back and not cedars and hemlocks. But just imagine a guy living out here all alone in a little cabin like this, and what he did was cut down cedar trees and make them into shingles and use them for building materials, and he would send them to some of the other settlements in the area, like Mukilteo, that was growing a lot and needed building materials. Now, this was hard work. He stayed for his 4 years and got the deed to the land, and then he said, forget about it. I'm not going to do this anymore. This is too hard work for me. I'm leaving. So he went and he sold the land to a couple of guys up in Mukilteo named Fowler and Frost, and he sold it for $160, $1 an acre, to Fowler and Frost. And the land sat there then for a few years. Now remember, he was here in 1866, so he sold it 4 years later, 1870. Okay, now there's some other dates here that you're going to be aware of. And now, this guy comes on the scene. You all know who he is, right?
George Brackett.
George Brackett! Yes, indeed. What did George Brackett do? Why is he famous?
He kind of started Edmonds.
He kind of started Edmonds. Yeah, he kind of did, yes.
Founded Edmonds.
He founded Edmonds. Yes, indeed, he did. Well, George Brackett was a logger. His business was cutting down trees and turning them into lumber as fast as it could happen. He was born in eastern Canada. He was one of 20 children. Now, eastern Canada had been logged over quite a lot. He had a big family of loggers, and George Brackett decided he was going to go someplace where there are lots of big trees and found his own lumber camp. Now, if you're a surfer and you want to surf the biggest waves, where do you go? Hawaii, the North Shore of Oahu, that's right. If you're a gambler and you want to have the biggest stakes and the biggest piles, where do you go?
Las Vegas.
Las Vegas, or maybe Monte Carlo. If you're a logger and you want to cut the biggest trees, where do you go? You bet. You come right out here, and that's what he did. He came out to Washington State. And he started logging here, down in the Ballard and Magnolia area in Seattle. Cut down a bunch of trees there, but he was working for somebody else. And his dream was to have his very own lumber camp and his own little town. He wanted to run the whole thing. He was a very energetic guy. He loved to canoe. He had a canoe, and he explored all up and down Puget Sound in his own little canoe. And as the story unfolds, he was paddling past Edmonds one day, or what is now Edmonds, when a storm came up and blew him ashore. And it blew him ashore down at, I'll let you know, Brackett's Landing. That's why they call it Brackett's Landing, because that's where George Brackett got blown ashore. This was in 1870, and George Brackett got out of his canoe and looked around Edmonds, and what did he see? Yeah, big, big trees. And it was a nice low bank. They were easy to get at. And George Brackett, being the logger that he was, saw these big trees, and the dollar signs started going around in his head. He saw his thought, oh boy, there's money right there. This is the place that I want to come. He came back 2 years later after he finished what was going on in Seattle, his logging operations there, and went up to those guys in Mukilteo who had bought Pleasant Buell's 160 acres for $160. And he said, I want to buy that. And they sold it to him for $650. Yeah, they were making money off of this. You know, it's real estate dealing back then, as much like real estate dealing is now. But George Brackett bought the land in Edmonds for $160, called some of his logger friends, and they went to work logging the Edmonds area. And here's some of that operation. Look at these guys. These are the old growth trees. These are springboards that the loggers would stand on, and they'd have this big crosscut saw that they'd go back and forth with, all by hand, no chainsaws back then. Then you had to get the logs out. There were no tractors, so they used oxen. And this is George Brackett right here with his team of oxen. And they're dragging all these logs out to bring them down to the waterfront. Another picture of these trees. I just want to give you an idea of the size of these trees that these guys were cutting. And these guys were doing all this by hand with no equipment other than just hand saws and axes. Yes, sir?
Did it take them more than a day to cut down one tree?
You know, I'll bet they cut down, they could probably cut through that with a crew like this in maybe an hour. Well, then they'd have to cut the tree all up into pieces, but they could, you know, initially make it fall down in probably about an hour. Here they are on a back cut, a couple of loggers lying in there. That's kind of a small tree compared to some of these others. Here again, loggers standing by these huge trees that they've been cutting down. Now, what's going to do with these trees? Well, George Brackett built a mill to cut them up into lumber. And this was right down at the foot of Bell Street, very close to where, you all know in Brackett's Landing Park, the jetty that you walk out on, that stone jetty, was right about opposite that jetty, was George Brackett's mill. And there he would cut the logs up into lumber and then bring them out to this wharf where they could be picked up by boats and brought to wherever they were going to go. Now, George Brackett's wharf was not very far out into the water. And George Brackett's wharf had one problem. It was great when the tide was in, at high tide, but when the tide was out, the boats couldn't land here. But that wasn't too big a problem for George because he was able to just store his lumber up on that dock, and then when the tide came in again, the boats would come back in and pick it up and go. But this is going to be an issue that's going to come up later. Just remember that George Brackett's wharf was not usable at low tide. Here's another picture of George Brackett's mill. Not a very good picture, I'm afraid. So we'll just move on. Now, George Brackett's not the only one that built a mill on the Edmonds waterfront. Here's Brackett's mill over here, but by the turn of the century, there were probably 17 or 18 mills all up and down the Edmonds waterfront. We were in a very heavy industrial period. There were lots of people here cutting down these huge trees and chopping them up into lumber and making shingles out of them. Now, at about this time, there were more people coming into town. You already saw this picture once, but there's a reason I'm showing it to you again. George Brackett decided that it was time to make Edmonds into an official town, because there were enough people coming in that it could be an official town and not a logging camp anymore. So the process of making that happen involved petitioning the Secretary of State in Olympia, the Washington State Secretary of State, not the U.S. one. So George wrote up the petition to say, we want to be a town, and circulated it around town and had people sign it, sent it into the Secretary of State in Olympia, and the Secretary of State in Olympia sent it right back to him and said, George, you're 2 signatures short. We can't make you a town. We need 2 more names. George was undeterred by that, so he added, whoops, can I go backward? How do I go backward?
You have to go to the other side of the screen and tap it on the other side.
Oh, gosh. Well,
Ginger.
it's not doing it.
It wasn't?
You know, it keeps going forward. I'm gonna,
You can do the arrows.
I'm
Here.
having,
Could you step up?
I'm trying to do page up and page down, which doesn't want
Yeah.
to be there.
Right.
Oh, maybe
So,
I need to
The
take
arrow
them.
up, the arrow down.
Arrow up, arrow down.
Yep. So that's, where do you want to go? Back?
I want to go here.
Okay.
Okay, here we are, guys. Yes.
So think he had 2 oxen.
You know the story I'm going to tell, right? Do you remember the name of the oxen? There was 2 lead oxen, his favorite oxen. Who were
I
they?
think one started with a B.
Bolivar. What was the other one? Simon. So the names of Simon and Bolivar Brackett got added to the petition to make Edmonds a town. He sent it back to the Secretary of State and says, okay, you got all the signatures you want. He didn't realize that 2 of them were oxen. It got approved, and Edmonds officially became a town on August 11th, 1890. So remember what that means for you guys. Teresa was talking to you earlier about a time capsule that's going to be happening this year, because this year is 125 years since Edmonds became a town, and since these 2 oxen's names were the ones that pushed us over the top. Now here's Edmonds in about 1891. This is about a year after we actually became a town. Remember what this used to be? A dense forest of old-growth trees. Look at what's happened in just those few years since George Brackett and his friends arrived in about 1792 and started logging it off. And here we are 20 years later. Some of the streets are still here that you recognize today. There's a few trees standing over here, but not a lot. Edmonds was really growing, and it was growing fast. Because of this, it wasn't just loggers and mill workers here anymore. There were people to run other businesses to help support these, and one of them was a guy named Matthew Heiner, who opened up a general store. This is right down by where the ferry landing is now. If you know where Waterfront Coffee is, and Dimitri's Taverna Grill, this is right there. Okay? And Matthew Heiner ran the store, but he was also the postmaster for the town. You might not be able to read that, but that says post office here. And this is Matthew Heiner's house. Now, Matthew Heiner had 2 daughters. And as postmaster, it was his job to go out and meet the mail boat every day when it would come in with the sacks of mail. And his daughters would wait up here in the cupola of the house and watch for the mail boat coming around the bend and into the bay by Edmonds. And they'd call down and say, Dad, mail boat's here. And Matthew would grab his sack of mail and run out to the end of Brackett's Wharf and give the boat the outgoing mail and take in the incoming mail. But remember, Brackett's Wharf, no good at low tide. So at low tide, when his daughter said, Dad, the mailboat's here, he would have to come down and get his little skiff and row out to meet the boat and exchange it there. That was a lot of work, and he didn't like that. But that was part of his job as postmaster. Well, one of the first things that the new city of Edmonds did, remember we started in 1890, one of the first things that Edmonds decided to do was build a deep water wharf. They wanted to do that, so they built City Dock. And let's see, I think I'm getting a little ahead of my story here. I'll go back, I'll talk about City Dock in a minute. This is downtown Seattle. This is the Coleman Dock where the ferry boats stop now in downtown Seattle. But I'm showing you this to show you all these little steamers. Remember how the Native Americans used Puget Sound as a superhighway for their canoes going back and forth? Well, this same superhighway was used by the European settlers and their descendants, but they, instead of using canoes, used little steamships. And these little steamships would travel all over Puget Sound in the same way that the Native American canoes did. And there were thousands of these boats, like 2,000 or more of these steamships. I tapped the
Just
screen
click on
again.
it. Just tap the screen somewhere else.
Tap it somewhere else and that would go away?
Yeah.
All right. Does anyone know what all these boats were called collectively? They have a really cool name. Has anyone ever heard of the Mosquito Fleet? That's what all these boats were. Do you know why they got called the Mosquito Fleet?
Because there were a bunch of smaller boats.
Well, there were a bunch of smaller boats. Yes,
Because they go everywhere around Puget Sound.
that would be a good reason too.
Because they were fast.
They weren't particularly fast, no. It was a reporter, a news reporter, somebody who works kind of like I do for Teresa, who was writing an article, and he was watching all these ships running around out there, and he said, you know, all these boats, there's thousands of them out there on Puget Sound, they look like a swarm of mosquitoes. So we call them the Mosquito Fleet, and the name stuck. The mosquito fleet boats, just like the ones from the Native American days when the canoes ran all up and down Puget Sound, stopped at every settlement. There was always a little wharf for a landing, and they could drop off goods, they could exchange mail, people would travel passengers. So the mosquito fleet was kind of the next generation, if you will, of vessels that used Puget Sound as their superhighway. Now we'll talk about City Dock. Okay, the city built its own dock. There was a nice deep water one, and the mosquito fleet could land there regardless of the tide, whether it was high, low, or indifferent. And here's a shot looking out on City Dock and one of the mosquito fleet ships sitting at the end of that. And here's another one, right at the end of City Dock. This particular one was the City of Everett, one of the larger of the mosquito fleet ships. Has anyone ever here taken a sail on the Virginia 5? The Virginia 5 is the last remaining mosquito fleet ship, and it's maintained as kind of a floating museum. And there's a Virginia 5 Foundation. It docks in downtown Seattle, and occasionally they have excursions on it. I've had the pleasure of being on the Virginia 5. It's amazing to be on this little piece of history. It's got a big steam engine on the inside, and one of the cool things that they do is they grill hot dogs on top of the steam engine because it gets so hot. Here's another shot out at the end of City Dock. Now, it wasn't just ships that were going up and down Puget Sound. The railroad came to Edmonds also. The railroad came here in 1891, and that was another way for all these mills in Edmonds that made shingles and lumber and Excelsior and all these wonderful forest products, another way to get them to the various markets. Here's the original Edmonds Passenger Railroad Station. And here, this is a much more modern picture. This is from 1947, but I wanted to show this because it's such a cool picture of a steam locomotive coming into the station down here in Edmonds. So this is what the waterfront area was looking like as we approached the turn of the century. We had the railroad in. We had a line of mills all along the waterfront, many of them making shingles, some of them lumber, some of them Excelsior, some of them other things. You know what Excelsior is? Excelsior is like wood shavings. They used to use it back before there was styrofoam as packing material. And it's just these wood shavings that just give some cushioning to material. It was very flammable though. And styrofoam, I think, is probably better as a packing material, or bubble wrap or something like that. It was the bubble wrap of the turn of the century, turn of the last century. Now, here's a shot inside these mills. These mills were very busy, very hot, very dangerous places. They had a single steam engine, typically, that ran everything in the mill, and it was connected to all the other equipment with a series of belts and pulleys and shafts and other things that were constantly spinning. Real dangerous places. The mill workers who worked in here, you didn't work in here very long before you lost a finger or something like that in this equipment. It was not safe at all. But there were lots of jobs here. And the foresters, the loggers, were out cutting down these trees, and they would cut the cedars up into these bolts and send them down to the mills. And here they are. They would throw them into Puget Sound, and then people would float them over to the mills, and they'd cut them up mainly to make shingles. Shingles were the big thing in the Edmonds mills. We made lots and lots of shingles. Cedar cuts up and splits very nicely into shingles. Great building material. Here's some folks some of the mill workers pushing a big pallet of shingles into a drying kiln. They would first cut the shingles, then put them on these pallets, and then dry them out really good before they would sell them. And these shingles were traveling by rail and by ship. Edmonds was supplying building materials from Alaska to Southern California. We were an industrial powerhouse here. It was amazing to think of it now with all of the industry gone. The last mill closed in 1953. That we were once a big industrial town. Here's some of these logs coming right down Main Street. You recognize the old Schumacher building? You know what's in that now? Chanterelle Restaurant. It's there now. And these are some of the folks who worked in the mills. There were typically a lot of young men who, typically single, typically had been perhaps unemployed or very marginally employed, and all of a sudden they got good jobs here in the Edmonds mills. Edmonds was a great place to come for a job. We had lots of mills working, and there was lots of work available for these folks. The mill workers typically stayed in rooming houses that were down near the waterfront. This is one of them, the Eagle Cafe and the Eagle Hotel. This is down kind of close to where the new Indian restaurant, the Copper Pot restaurant is now, sort of down at that end of Main Street. Here's the Royal Hotel, which was directly across the street from it. And here's another great site looking up Main Street. Here's rooms for rent, there are saloons. It was kind of a rough and tumble area. I think of it as the Wharf District here in Edmonds. This is where the workers were. They worked really hard during the day in the mills in a dangerous job, and then they played really hard in their off hours, and these were the places where they went to play. There were pool rooms, card rooms, again, saloons, rooms for rent, cafes, all of it dedicated to these folks who kept the mills going. But up the street here, there was a rather different Edmonds. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, here we are, like 2 blocks up the street. This is more the commercial district of Edmonds. Now remember, we had the workers down at the wharf. Up here were families, the folks who owned the mills, businesses. It was a very different kind of area. It wasn't just a mill worker town up here. It was more of a family town. And there were churches, theaters, restaurants, things like that. Schools, of course, were part of this. As more people came to Edmonds, schools were built, and this is Edmonds' very first single-room schoolhouse. It was built in 1887, and the first class was 15 students, and if you count them here, there were 15, and a teacher. These were the first students in this one-room schoolhouse. Now remember, Edmonds was growing really fast. 1887 here. Here we are in 1889, a lot more students. They had pretty much filled this schoolhouse up, and Edmonds needed a new schoolhouse. So George Brackett came along and donated some land, and the very next year, in 1891, a brand new schoolhouse was finished. And that's this one. This is now up kind of where Francis Anderson Field is, up behind the Francis Anderson Center. That's where this building was, and this was Edmonds' original grade school. It opened in 1891, and it stayed open for many years after that. I'm going to read some notes. There's some dates that I'm trying to remember. And here's another shot of that school. And here you see some of the first classes of students on the steps of that old Victorian school. And as Edmonds' population grew, so did the size of the classes, and so did the number of students going to the school. Filled up pretty good. This is interesting. Many of the students that were going to the schools here in Edmonds had to be bussed in from some of the neighboring areas like Meadowdale. Their parents would be out there, maybe they had farms, they had other businesses going out there, or they lived a little further out. So the school district got buses to help bring the students here to school. And this is one of the very first school buses. This was built by the Yosts, actually, down in the Yost garage. And there's a really cool story about this school bus. I guess it didn't take the students long to realize that the end of the bus extended way back over the rear wheels. And if they all piled into the back of the bus, what would happen? The front wheels would come up off of the ground. Yeah. Oh, the students used to love to do this. Drove the bus driver crazy. Here's another one showing that. You just run in the back of here, and down it would go, and it would raise the front wheels off of the ground. So they had to try to distribute the students as evenly as possible in there. But the students, of course, every time someone's back was turned, they'd all run to the back of the bus and see if they could get the front wheels to come up. Now, it's very difficult to talk about schools in Edmonds without talking about the most famous teacher and educator that has ever passed through Edmonds. Do you know who this is? Most famous teacher ever. I'm sure you know the name. This is Francis Anderson. Okay? This is Francis Anderson as she looked in her graduation picture. She graduated from Edmonds High School. In fact, Edmonds High School had just been built, and she was in the first graduating class in 1911. Now, Frances Anderson was born in Montana in 1890, and she came to Edmonds the very next year when she was 1 year old, a little baby. Her parents brought her here because her dad worked for the railroad, and the railroad brought him out here, and they settled in Edmonds and lived here. Now, sadly, her father was killed in a really strange train accident in 1907. He was walking down the tracks, he was inspecting the tracks and wasn't looking for the train, and the train hit him. But Frances Anderson and her family stayed here in Edmonds, and she went to Edmonds grade school, graduated from there, then was in the first graduating class at Edmonds High School. And one of the things Frances Anderson loved was sports. Who here likes sports? Who likes basketball? Frances Anderson was a major basketball player. She loved basketball. And here she is, holding a basketball, part of the Edmonds Athletic Club. But she was on basketball team in high school, and then actually went to the University of Washington, was on basketball team there and a couple of other teams. She won 3 varsity ladders while she was at the University of Washington, studying to become a teacher. But I love these pictures because you can always tell who Frances Anderson is because she's the one holding the basketball. And there she is again. You know who she is, right? The one with the basketball. Yeah. She was quite the athlete. She was very good. She excelled at many sports. Now, she graduated with a teaching degree in 1917 and came back to Edmonds and was hired on to teach second grade at the Edmonds Elementary School. And she was to stay in the Edmonds school system for her entire career. She started out here teaching second grade in 1917. In 1924, she became principal of the Edmonds Elementary School. Later, in 1933, Edmonds had outgrown that old wooden school that you saw, the Victorian one, and a brand new Edmonds Elementary School was built, and Frances Anderson just moved right over here and was principal of this school. In fact, she stayed principal of Edmonds Elementary until 1949. At that point, she said, I'm not going to be principal anymore, but she went back to teaching second grade, and she taught second grade for another 10 years until 1959 when she retired completely. Here's another picture of Frances Anderson walking along the waterfront. She loved Edmonds, just like I do, just like we all do in here, because I saw those hands go up before. And here's Frances Anderson in some later years. She's back teaching second grade here. She used to be principal. Now she's a second grade teacher again. She loved teaching second grade, and she's back with her students here at this point. Frances Anderson died in 1990. She was almost 100 years old when she died. And Edmonds was almost 100 years old, too. She died like the month before Edmonds' 100th birthday in 1990. But the old school was bought up by the city and was turned into the Frances Anderson Cultural and Leisure Center, Frances Anderson Recreation Center. Many of you have been there. You've probably taken classes there. You've probably played in the field. Anybody played soccer in the field back there? Okay. So now you know who Frances Anderson is. One of the most important people in Edmonds history. With a little bit of time I have left, I want to talk to you about a couple of other things. Edmonds is known to a lot of folks for being a place where the ferries stop. And we actually started having ferry service here back in 1923, a long time ago. The roads had just been completed into Edmonds, and this is the very first ferry. This is called the Spirit of Edmonds, or no, City of Edmonds, I'm sorry. And this was the first ferry boat that started running in 1923. And here it is on one of its maiden voyage. I think it was its maiden voyage, and you can't really read this because it's out of focus, but this is the Edmonds City Park Band, and they had a big celebration on the ship, and out it went, and it started the official ferry service. Edmonds soon became known as the gateway to the Olympics. If you want to go to the Olympics, you come through Edmonds and you take a ferry here. And it didn't take long for a lot of cars to start coming here and start using our boats. You've all seen the cars line up at the ferry lines, right? Especially on holiday weekends. Well, that's not a new thing. They were doing this. Here's 4th of July, 1927. Look at the cars all lined up to get on the ferry. Here they are again, all lined up, waiting for the ferry boat. Again, lines of cars. Here they are going up Main Street, all waiting to get on that ferry. And this is also 4th of July, 1927. Everybody going over to the Olympics. Here they are again. Now, as Edmonds moved into the 1920s and 30s, businesses were growing here a little bit more. The downtown area started to develop. There were more stores and shops and restaurants. This is in probably the early 1930s. I'm going to put this about 1932 or 1933. And downtown Edmonds looking a little bit like it does today. There's the movie theater. Right? Who's been to the Edmonds movie theater? Okay, that's a really neat historic building. That's one of the last single-screen theaters left in the country. And it's an historic site, actually. Here we are again, looking in downtown Edmonds, kind of mid-century, a little before mid-century. Another street shot, another one. There's the theater once again. You can see Edmonds starting to grow up a bit. Now, as we move out of the 30s and into the 1940s, well, you know what happened in 1941, right? Yes, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and the United States went into World War II. It was a pretty dangerous time for everybody, but it changed things a lot. There was there were the soldiers, of course, that were fighting the war in the various war theaters, but there was also a thing called the home front, where folks who lived at home were doing things to help support the war effort. And one of the things they did was collect scrap metal. And this is a scrap metal drive that was going on right here in Edmonds. People bringing down all sorts of old things. It even looks like there's an old car in here that could be melted down and turned into the material of war. Jeeps, airplanes, weapons. There was an old watchtower that got built during World War II. This is an aircraft watchtower that was built actually right on the site of the old First Edmonds Elementary School, right behind, you know where Toshi's Teriyaki is and Claire's Restaurant? Yeah, this was right behind that. And there was a lot of fear during World War II that the Japanese Air Force might attack the west coast of the United States. And this was there so that, and people manned that 24 hours a day. There was always somebody up there looking to see if there were any enemy aircraft coming in. Luckily, none did, but it was a great spot to take pictures. And here are some pictures taken from the top of the old aircraft watchtower. And you can see what Edmonds looked like in the early 1940s. This is during the war. I mean, you can almost see in these pictures a certain wariness and a watchfulness about the town. Wartime was very different. Another shot from up there. Here's another. One thing that World War II and the metal drives did was establish a metal collection station right down at 5th and Main Street, right where the fountain is now. And this was the first traffic circle. It was actually a scrap metal collection place. So say, throw your aluminum cans here, and the cars had to drive around it. And a lot of people thought, hey, this isn't a bad idea. This is really cool to have a traffic circle in the middle of downtown Edmonds. And the idea sort of stuck. Somebody had the bright idea to put a holiday tree in there. And this is the very first Christmas tree in Edmonds, 1957. And this was put up right in the middle of the intersection down at 5th and Main. Here's another shot of that intersection. I can tell the date on this because that's a 1957 Mercury. I can tell that because it was built back when I was really into cars when I was younger. But there is a little stanchion here in the middle of the street. Unfortunately, it's behind that pole. The cars had to drive around it. Here we are again. Yeah, there's that stanchion again, and here's cars going around. So we still have this nice traffic circle. And then in 1974, the Edmonds Arts Commission decided this would be a great place for a piece of public art. So they commissioned this really cool old brass fountain. Do any of you remember seeing any of that? I don't think that was here with you guys. That probably predates you. But this is the first fountain that was in the middle of Edmonds. It was made by some local Edmonds artists. It was made out of brass. Here it is again. Many people thought it was kind of ugly, but it was our public art, and it was our main piece of public art right out there. And there it is again. Now, it stayed there from 1974 till 1998, when somebody, I think it was an accident, it wasn't because they maybe didn't like the fountain, but they rammed into it with their car and destroyed it. So the fountain was gone in 1998. So Edmonds was looking for something else to put in the center of that traffic circle. And it turned out that a film crew had been in Edmonds to film a made-for-TV movie, and they left behind one of their props. Oh, let me talk about this for a minute. There was a great place for the Christmas tree, too. This isn't a real tree. This, the old brass fountain is inside of this, and they put boughs on the outside to make it look like a tree. Same here. Here's that prop that was left behind by the movie crew. For the purposes of the movie, the town of Edmonds was called Eden, so they put it out there, and then there was, but once the fountain was destroyed, they had to put something in the middle. So I said, oh, hey, let's just get this from the movie crew. This was just made out of cheap lumber, like from Home Depot. It wasn't any great art or anything, but at least it sat there and took up space, and it was kind of pretty. It was replaced in 1999 by the fountain that you know there right now, the Cedar Dreams fountain that was designed by Seattle artist Benson Shaw. The Cedar Dreams fountain is a major piece of art. I think it is the major piece of public art in Edmonds, my personal favorite piece of public art in Edmonds, and it's a lot more than just a fountain. Have you ever looked at this thing closely and seen a lot of the aspects of it? I'm about to show you some. The main fountain itself was designed by Shaw to evoke a forest canopy. Forest up here and the uprights being trees. The railing and the balustrade around it, this little section in here, is designed to look like a cedar tree. And what about the pavement coming out? Look at those big swirls on the pavement. He designed the pavement so that it would evoke and reflect the old water wheels that were in the mills and the saw blades that were in the mills. The design extends onto the sidewalk even. There's plaques on various corners and inlays. This is part of the Cedar Dreams fountain design. These inlays, these are designed to evoke cedar trees and the glass drops of dew in the cedar. Again, the Cedar Dreams fountain was designed by Benson Shaw, and this shows some of that swirly design that's in those pavement blocks. Let me go back again. How did I go back before? Okay, yeah, there we go. Now we're coming up to the modern day. Do you know who this guy is? Elvis. Well, actually, it's not the real Elvis. That's an Elvis impersonator. Okay, and his name is Shane Cobain, and he comes here to town several times a year and does a fantastic Elvis show. If you've never seen Shane Cobain, you've got to go see him because he's good. He's really good. And one of my biggest favorite Elvis fans, this is my very special friend Janice Carr, who's standing there with Elvis, and very pleased to be there because she had actually met Elvis back when Elvis came to the Seattle World's Fair back in 1961. There's Elvis over here. And she was caught by a Seattle Times photographer after she got Elvis's signature. The markets that we have a spring market down behind the public safety building, and we have a summer market. This is a little shot of the spring market, which is due to open real soon, isn't it? When spring market opening?
Early May.
Early May? Yeah, beginning of May. So we're just a couple of weeks away from the spring market opening up. Here's a balloon man on stilts at the spring market. Edmonds is a great place for arts and music. This is the Edmonds Woodway High School Band performing at the Edmonds Jazz Connection. This happens every year where local high school bands and middle school bands come and play their stuff, and these students are wonderful. I never miss this event because it's great, great music, and the energy that these kids have is wonderful. Anybody here play an instrument? Okay, you're looking to join a band? Yeah. Well, let's hope you end up playing here, because this is wonderful stuff. Who knows who this is? Who is it? That's Kermit the Frog. Who's with Kermit? Who's Kermit's friend?
The frog lady.
The Frog Lady. Does anybody know the Frog Lady's name?
Oh, I don't know.
The Frog Lady is Thayer Cuter, and she runs the Amphibian Center down here. And I'm going through some of this now just to show you some of the ways that Edmonds has developed it today. Who's been to the Amphibian Center? Who likes frogs? Who likes turtles? Okay, well that's a place to be then. Here's some folks that from the Rotary that are taking tickets at the annual Waterfront Festival. Happens every year. You've been on this at the Waterfront Festival? Looks like fun, huh? Edmonds is a great arts community now. And the Arts Festival is one of the major events each year. It's usually held on Father's Day weekend, so it will be right in the middle of June. Artists come from all over the region, not just Washington State, but the whole Pacific Northwest region, Montana, Idaho, some come up from California to display and sell their wares at the art festival. Another shot of the art festival here. Summer market. Anybody been here? Sure you have, yeah. And I'm standing right next to the Cedar Dreams fountain. And there's that nice swirly stuff in the pavement. The Edmonds Museum, a wonderful place that helps preserve our heritage, and part of the reason that I'm here today. They also sell things at the market to try to raise a little bit of money. They usually sell youth stuff. It's kind of like a garage sale. They call it a white elephant sale, but I don't know, they're kind of nicer than white elephant stuff, I think. But one of the big things you want at that market is the produce. I love berries, and I love the berries from this particular stand. These are real good ones. Who has a dog at home? Edmonds is a great place if you're a dog. There's lots of wonderful things here to do in Edmonds. People generally love dogs in Edmonds, and we have the greatest dog park in the world, the off-leash park down by the water. Anybody taking their dog to the off-leash park? Yeah, isn't it wonderful? What a place for dogs. They just have a grand time. Look at them out there. They're just having a wonderful time. And the folks who own the dogs are having a wonderful time. This is Star, the one-eyed pit bull, and Star loves to play merry-go-round and get swung around. And you can see that happening. How about 4th of July parade? Anybody ride their bicycle or riding their bicycles in the 4th of July parade? Yeah, we got a lot of people that did that. 4th of July parade's great. We never miss it. Yeah, there's one of the clowns from the parade. Teresa and I had a grand time at the parade this year. We actually had a little table there, and we covered it live. It was one of the most fun things I've ever done. And of course, there's the fireworks at night over in City Park. Not City Park, the Civic Playfield. We also have concerts in the park and plays in the park. There's a Shakespeare company. Who likes William Shakespeare? Oh, right, good. Yeah, I'm a fan. Here they are again. Ever build a sandcastle? We have a sandcastle building. Who's been part of the Edmonds Sandcastle building down at Marina Beach? Okay, here's the folks building those, and the mayor actually came in and helped judge this. Of course, he had some helpers with him because he doesn't want to take responsibility for making that decision all by himself. You know, he wants to kind of spread that out a bit. Here's again, the sandcastle, sand sculpture. Who knows who this is? This is a famous Edmonds person. Anybody go to the Edmonds Library? Anybody ever meet the children's librarian at the Edmonds Library? Then you've met her. She does a lot of things. This is Edith Farrar. She is the children's librarian at the Edmonds Library, and she is also the drum majorette of the Sedentary Sousa Band. You know who John Philip Sousa was? He wrote a lot of famous military marches. Tell me. Okay, well, he was a musician, and he wrote marches, Washington Post March, a lot of them that are very famous. You can hear them and sing. I'd sing you one, but I can't. I'm horrible at that. But these are usually done by marching bands, where they'll play and they'll march along, and the majorettes will throw the batons in the air, and all that. But this is the Sedentary Sousa Band. They all sit in chairs. So Edith sits in a chair and does her baton twirling from the chair. And again, she does many other things. You say she comes in here and plays the accordion. Yeah, she's also the beach master at the annual polar bear swim. How about Halloween? Who goes to downtown on Halloween? You seen them dance Thriller down there? Yeah. Oh, and talk about the polar bear swim. Here they are. This is January 1st, and these crazy people diving into the water. And Edith is right back here somewhere out of the picture cheering them on. She serves as beach master for that event. And finally, a sunset here in Edmonds. We all love Sunset Avenue, and we love going to the beach, and we love going to Brackett's Landing, and we love seeing the sun go down behind the Olympics, behind our beautiful town. And remember, right here, back in 1870, was where George Brackett landed and found the forest that started the whole thing going. And those big trees that were here, that are no longer here, was what built Edmonds from the beginning. It's what made us what we are. It was the original wealth of Edmonds, and the trees being cut down, going through the mills, establishing the town, building the economy, and it brought us to where we are today. And I think that's just about it for me. We have questions? Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions? You have a question?
I'm not so sure, but I think the year that Michael Phelps won his 8th medal, I was at the sandcastle contest, and I think they said that he was there at the Edmonds sandcastle contest.
I remember they did that. I don't know if he was there physically, but they built a Michael Phelps sand sculpture.
They did.
Yes, I remember seeing that one. In fact, I might have a picture of it somewhere, but I don't have it with me right now. But yeah, I think they built a Phelps sand sculpture. I don't know if he was there in person. He should have been. He should have seen the sand sculpture. If he wasn't there, he should have been.
Yeah, I think they announced that he built it.
Okay. Yes.
Was he the founder? Was he also mayor?
George Brackett?
Was he ever the mayor?
Yes, George Brackett was the first mayor of Edmonds. Yes, you're right. Anything else anyone wants to add or ask or comment?
Jason, didn't you have a question before your hand was up? So one thing I noticed is that the Native Americans had added a wind sail on their canoes. So was that after they saw the Europeans' big ships with big sails that they added that, or would they have used sails before the Europeans, before they saw the European boats?
I don't know for sure, but I can guess. And my guess is that they would have employed sails before they saw the Europeans using them. Polynesians in their ocean-going canoes were using sails long before there was any European contact in that corner of the Pacific. And I would think it would be a pretty logical thing to put a sail up on one of those canoes and save some of that cliff and work as well. So that's my guess, but it's nothing more than a guess. Well, thank you very much. You've been a wonderful group. I've loved talking to you. I love coming out and talking to student groups because I used to be a teacher, and this was great. So thank you very much.